Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In Yemen, Houthis have used a bomb-laden drone in an attack on a military parade in Aden, killing 6 troops and injuring several senior military commanders. The brazen move by Houthis proves their growing military capabilities. It also throws a wrench into what was hoped to be a peace process that was picking up pace since the Hodaida ceasefire and prisoner exchange. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined now by Mr. Hussein al-Bukhaiti, who is a Yemeni journalist who is joining us from the Yemeni capital, Sana'a. We're also joined by Mr. Bara Shiban, who is a Yemeni activist speaking to us from London. And we're also finally joined by Hodaida, who is a political analyst, and he is joining us from Istanbul. Gentlemen, thank you all for joining us. Bara, I'd like to start with you and get your reaction to this drone attack on this military parade.
Well, I think as you mentioned, the problem of the attack, the timing will definitely have its impact on the the hopeful political resolution that was put in place. But I think the importance is that it's the first time that the Houthis attack this far to Al-Anad Air Base, which is one of the biggest and major military bases in the country. Now there has been rumors about what has been caused as a result of this drone attack, but I think the significance is just the fact that they have been able to reach this far and target this military parade.
Hodaida, you've been listening to our guests there. What are your thoughts on this attack and how much of an obstacle this would create for any peace?
The fact that they were able to attack this particular parade and possibly kill I'm not sure if these reports are confirmed, but there are individuals who are very significant that were there who have been either killed or injured, including Yemen's intelligence service head and the governor of Lahej province. And so the Houthis must have had some intelligence about this meeting. They were able to coordinate and execute this sophisticated attack using some technology that the source of which is not clear. There are reports that say that this is a kind of imported technology. The Iranians are the ones who are being accused of bringing this technology into Yemen. The Houthis also claim that they might have the capacity to produce this domestically in Yemen. So this is taking the conflict to a level that we were not necessarily aware of in the past, that the Houthis have conducted attacks, cross-border attacks, let's say, and even attacks against Yemeni government troops and UAE troops, but this is one of the more high-profile ones. It was a very dramatic scene with the drone exploding right off the stage where they were giving this speech at a military parade. So this was a very dramatic act on behalf of the Houthis, and it definitely will cause all of the parties to think twice about the deals that were made in Sweden.
Very well. And Bara, what do you make of what Hussein had said earlier as well about the fact that, and that's a fair point I would imagine to bring up, isn't it, Bara, that the truce was ready just for so at this point in time, it seems that anywhere else in the country is pretty much fair game?
The redeployment plan is faltering very clearly. The humanitarian convoy that was supposed to head from Sana'a towards from the port of Hodeida towards Sana'a, that was also blocked, and this time by the Houthis. So even in Hodeida, the truce didn't hold. But the fact that they did attack a military base deep into Lahej, no, it does affect the deal in general. I mean, you cannot imagine having a major escalation and then imagine it won't affect the political process or don't have any effect on the talks. But I think right now there are a lot of questions about the Hodeida talks. Will it stand actually, and will something change on the ground? So far, nothing has changed. Even the redeployment plan, which was very clear and stated within a very clear time frame, that has also passed. So it does put a real question whether anything will materialize from the Stockholm Agreement.
So I wanted to ask Hussein, what do you make of the reports by the UN humanitarian chief, specifically about the Houthis blocking humanitarian supplies from entering areas that are under their control to the government-controlled areas in the country? You know, Mark Lowcock also saying that Houthis are now demanding 72 hours instead of 48 hours to notice, that is, on the part of humanitarian agencies to let such supplies in. Why would the Houthis be doing that, Hussein?
I mean, I don't know how can he say that, because we remember that the United Nations and many NGOs working in Yemen have said many times that Hodaida is the last lifeline for humanitarian aid, and they have insisted and said that 70% to 80% of humanitarian aid coming to Yemen, come through Hodaida port. And who was in control of the entire city and the Hodaida province? It was Ansarullah, the Houthis. So this means that the Houthis did not obstruct any of the humanitarian aid coming into Yemen. And just imagine, Houthis are in control of Hodaida port only. The Saudi-backed forces are in control of all other ports and airports. And 70% of humanitarian aid is coming through this port. And for Bara Shayban to say that the Houthis are blocking the road that bring this humanitarian aid, I think this is just a big lie, because the road was open until the Saudi-backed forces attacked Hodaida, and they have cut this road, which is called Kilo 16, east of Hodaida, that goes to Sana'a. But there is another road that's called Asham Road, which goes from north of Hodaida and then it goes to Sana'a with only different 2 hours from the main road. So the United Nations, if they're really willing to bring humanitarian aid, they can bring it through that road. So they don't need to wait till the two parties fighting in Hodaida agree about the movement of their troops or the withdrawal of their troops. This means that the 17 million actually depend on the security situation and the movement of the troops. They should the humanitarian aid coming to Yemen should be independent. They should not link it to this withdrawal. And there are other roads that can go to many areas in Yemen, but it seems to be that the United Nations is actually using the humanitarian crisis in Yemen that's only caused by the Saudi-led coalition blockade in Yemen. They are using it as a weapon. This is what the Saudi as well is doing. They are using it as a weapon to bring against.
If you allow me, Hussein, I wanted to point you just made to Hodaida. Hodaida, do you think that the UN is in some ways using this humanitarian issue to try to force maybe both sides to come to the table, or are using it for its own political gains? What exactly is the game here? Because at the end of the day, Hodaida, both sides, while they're fighting, it is really the Yemeni people who continue to suffer on either side.
I think that this is a perfect way to understand why the agreement that was recently made in Sweden doesn't hold a lot of water. Some of the basic confidence-building measures that were agreed to, such as the prisoner exchange, have not been completed yet. We don't know what is the fate of this agreement. The second issue here is that, as you mentioned, the Yemeni people are the ones who are being directly affected by this war. Both people who are backing the Saudi-backed forces and people who support the Houthi Ansarullah forces. So this is something that has to do with an internal dynamic inside Yemen. And I think what the foreign minister here in Turkey, Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, said yesterday is pertinent. And that is that Turkey is saying that it's going to make reaching a political solution in Yemen, a peaceful political solution in Yemen, a priority for Turkey in 2019. Turkey is taking a similar stance in other regional conflicts as well. Turkey believes that countries that are closer to the region, countries that are more associated and affiliated with the region culturally and geographically and economically even, should be at the forefront of finding solutions to these conflicts. And I think this is a clear sign of the UN's inability to find any resolution in this conflict in Yemen, just like it's unable to find resolutions in other conflicts in the region. And so countries like Turkey are going to have to step up and try and move this forward.
But Hodaida, why do you think the countries in the region have not yet forward enough, at least, to be able to lead any peace process?
The issue here is that the countries that are already involved, let's say Iran and Saudi Arabia, that are involved in kind of like a proxy war, if you will, in Yemen, they are so entrenched into their positions that they don't have the ability to clear the table and sit face to face and figure out how they want to move forward and solve the conflict. They need other people, mediators, to come in and try and bring them closer together, bring the issues closer together, and help the parties see a way forward. Saudi Arabia has invested a lot of time and money and effort into the war in Yemen, and so have the Houthis with the backing of Iran. But it's time for both of the parties to cut their losses. Saudi Arabia now has huge incentive to wrap up the war because it's getting expensive. There's a lot of geopolitical pressure on them in the region and internationally because of human rights issues and other geopolitical factors that are forcing Saudi Arabia to go back to the negotiating table. Iran might be interested to go to the negotiating table as well, and Turkey is going to take advantage of that to try and bring them together and find some progress, or to reach some progress where the UN has failed.
Okay, so let me put that point to Bara then. But I think countries like Turkey or others in the region should come in and play a more leading role, because genuinely, if we're honest, the United Nations has not really succeeded in this regard. And as Hodaida there said, countries who may lie on either side of this conflict and who are entrenched in this situation possibly would not and are not at this point in time able to talk directly or to try to compromise with each other.
Sure, but let me quickly respond to some of the questions that were imposed by Hussein al-Bukhaiti.
Sure.
First of all, the port of Hodaida is the biggest port. So why there hasn't been more humanitarian aid or shipments to other ports? Basically because they don't have the capacity. The biggest port for it's almost now 2 decades has been the Hodaida port. And only it makes sense that, and more than 70% of the population live in the north of the country. So that's why most of the humanitarian shipments will obviously go to Hodaida. And that's why there was a peace plan for Hodaida specifically. Now, for Hussein al-Bukhaiti to say there is another road, this is not part of the agreement. The agreement was to end the hostilities, and that's why they chose the UN convoy to move through the specific roads so that both sides can open up the roads and then do the redeployment plan, which is basically the new forces, the joint forces that were added that came recently by the Saudi-led coalition should withdraw to the south of the city, and the Houthis should come out from the city and leave to the north of the city. That was the plan, and it was the UN who accused the Houthis of theft of the humanitarian aid. That's not a report I brought from my own. But regarding your question about Turkey. I think there are no countries who are much invested into seeing a final solution in Yemen. Turkey, at the end of the day, does not have more of, I would say, a strategic alliance with the country. You could refer to it as a friendly country. It has some friendly relationships with Yemen over the last few decades. But it's not one of the countries that has huge investments. Yemen is not at the border with Turkey. So whatever happens in Yemen, it will affect Turkey. There are other mediators that I think can play a role. I mean, Kuwait could be a possibility, and they have announced repeatedly that they are willing to host peace talks. I think recently the European Union have been offering to host more rounds of consultations and peace talks. Yeah. So it depends, I think, on the specific country and whether there is a new view inside Turkey that they're willing to do something different.
Very well. We're just going to go for a very short break, gentlemen, and we'll go back after this break with the rest of this conversation. Stay with us. Viewers, we're back now here in The Scope, continuing our discussion about that Houthi attack, drone attack that is, on that base in the Yemeni city of Aden. Let's go to Hussein al-Bukhaiti now. Hussein, you heard from Bara there as well about, and Hodaida, about finding a possible neutral party who could possibly mediate this situation in Yemen. Who do you think, firstly, could play such a role? Because obviously we need this situation to end, and I imagine all sides at this point in time would like for this to end for their own respective reasons.
I think we shouldn't, because the problem that we have now in Yemen is just that the Saudi Arabia interfere in Yemen because they say they want to stop the interference of Iran. So Yemen has many crises before. We had many wars between each other. I mean, most of Yemeni presidents in the last 50 years, either in north of Yemen or what used to be the south, has been assassinated. Many coups, as they call it, has been going on Yemen for the last 50 years. But we didn't have this huge catastrophe, this huge humanitarian crisis where 70 million are starving and over 16,000 died because direct airstrike. 250,000 Yemeni civilians died because of the blockade, because of preventable diseases. One child died every 10 minutes according to the UNICEF. This is because of the outside interference. If the Yemeni will sit to each other without any outside interference, will talk to each other, then this means that we can solve this issue. And I want to just mention one point that Mr. Bara Shayban has said about that. He said that Hodaida port is the largest port in Yemen. Of course, I didn't say it was not the largest port, but he seems to forget that the Saudi-led coalition from the first weeks of their attack and war in Yemen have targeted all the cranes in Hodaida port. They are now, all the big cranes are out of service. They are not working. So this means that the port cannot receive large ships, as Mr. Bara Shayban have mentioned. Most of the ships now in Hodaida are small-sized ships, and most of the goods are taken by hand by workers from those ships, and sometimes small cranes that were offered by World Food Program, which they come on a truck, are used to take. But large ships, container ships, the Hodaida port is unable to receive any of these. And I want to mention, for example, about Taiz. They keep crying out loud that Taiz is under the blockade, that Taiz is under the blockade. And this is a big lie, because there are many roads that under the control of the Saudi-backed coalition. And you must know that most of the food and humanitarian aid coming into Taiz is coming from Hodaida, is coming from Houthi-controlled areas. But you have Mocha port, west of Taiz, which is so close to Taiz city. The United Arab Emirates has turned this port into a military base. I mean, if they do care about Yemeni civilians, especially in Taiz, why are they only bringing to Taiz city? They are bringing tanks, military equipment, United Arab armored vehicles, and they are unable to bring food because, as they say, there is a Houthi blockade on Taiz. There is a total blockade in Yemen. The Amnesty International have said in a long report last year, they said that the Saudi-led coalition is deliberately obstructing or not allowing or delaying ships with humanitarian aid. They mentioned deliberately many times in Hodaida. So the problem is the outside intervention. The problem is that the so-called legitimate government is in Aden.
Okay, so let me, Hussein, because you've said, Hussein, because you've said this should be solved internally in Yemen by Yemenis themselves. I want to put that point to Hodaida, because Hodaida, I imagine it can be argued, listen, that the Saudi Arabia has an interest in the situation because at the end of the day, Yemen does border it. It's a neighboring country. So Yemen will need to learn to come to peace and to come to terms with the fact that Saudi Arabia does share a border with it. And neighboring countries naturally have a stake in the situation for stability in Yemen, don't they?
I think that the issue goes beyond this because in reality, the tribes or the Arabs that live on the border between Saudi Arabia and Yemen are related and have family ties, and they have history. As Mr. Bukhaiti mentioned, there have been civil wars going on in Yemen for many decades, and this is driven by tribal ties and tribal relationships. And the Saudis have a direct role in affecting this conflict in the sense that they make alliances with specific tribes and specific groups of individuals. And this is how the conflict developed anyways after the coup and Ali Abdullah Saleh who was overthrown and
of course, Hodaida, I don't want to interrupt, but I would add that the Iranians obviously also have their alliances in Yemen too, don't they?
So the Iranians have managed through their Islamic Revolution movement, have managed to kind of co-opt the Ansarullah movement. And this is what many observers and skeptics would argue, that the Iranians have co-opted the Ansarullah movement. The Ansarullah movement is actually a Zaydi movement, which is not necessarily a 12er Shia, Ithna Ashri Shia sect of Islam, but in this particular case, they have made a political alliance, the Zaydis in Yemen, they have made a political alliance with the 12 Shia who adopt this Islamic revolutionary kind of ideology. And so this is where the confluence comes in. Saudi Arabia is dominated by a very Puritan approach to Islam, and this is diametrically opposed to the Zaydi and Ithna Ashri approach, especially that of the Islamic revolution that's based in Tehran and is led by Khamenei.
But nevertheless, though, that point that I'm trying to make remains, though, doesn't it? That regardless of the tribal and other possible religious factors that may be at play here, isn't the biggest factor, though, that for the Saudis, they would want stability on their border vis-a-vis Yemen?
Yes, I think the Saudis, they have a legitimate concern about their stability, but at the same time, it seems, as Mr. Bukhaiti has clearly described, that the Saudis and the Emiratis may not actually be pursuing policies that bring safety and security to the people in Yemen. A perfect example is that which Mr. Bukhaiti described in Taiz. And it really doesn't add up to me that there is not a road to get aid to people who have access to other services and other goods, but the critical food aid that's coming to Taiz is not making it because it's being diverted or it's being blocked, or military equipment and military goods are being given the priority. So you can see how this confluence is creating this humanitarian crisis on the ground. Yemenis are not able to sit at the same table and discuss the issue, Yemeni to Yemeni, and the external influence and the external interjections by these regional players is making the situation much more complicated.
All right, so but what make of what Hussein and Hodaida there have said? As I put the point there, but to Hodaida, certainly it's natural, isn't it, for the Saudis to want stability on their border, and of course he agreed. But then, what do you make of the various other factors that come into play here, be they tribal or even religious leanings?
Well, I find it quite ironic that Hussein al-Bukhaiti mentions Taiz, that he cares about all of the places he cares about Taiz, where the Houthis have imposed a siege, a literal siege on the entire city for more than 3 years now. And they blocked even humanitarian aid. Even water was prevented coming in. Humanitarian aid workers who tried to bring in water were arrested, detained, and tortured, and that's according to Human Rights Watch own reports. So I find it quite ironic that the situation in Taiz was just quickly summarized, that the Saudis and the Emiratis are just not willing to support, just end the siege. That would be the easiest solution, rather than finding other excuses. Now, regarding have they been conducting policies in Yemen well? No, I agree. There has been many situations where I think they should have been acting more responsibly, and they did not. And I'm here referring to the Saudis and the Emiratis. But as you said, Saudi Arabia do have a legitimate concern over what's happening inside Yemen. And the whole conflict could have been prevented if the Houthis did not go all the way and try to not just after they bombed President Hadi, they tried also to provoke Saudi Arabia by having these military maneuvers at the border of Saudi Arabia. No policymaker with just a sane mind would do such a thing when your country is trying to move and plan a coming elections. And this is what we have been trying to say to the Houthis since day one. You cannot act irresponsibly and then imagine for other countries just to sit down and do nothing, when your messaging and your tactics and what you are doing is clearly saying, we are here to impose a threat against you.
Okay. All right, gentlemen, the clock has gotten the best of us, so we'll leave that as our final word. But of course, we appreciate all of your insights and analysis. That was Bara Shaban, Yemeni activist, speaking to us from the British capital, London. We were also joined by Hodaida Hitu, political analyst, who is speaking to us from Istanbul. And finally, we were also speaking to Mr. Hussein al-Bukhaiti, Yemeni journalist, who was with us from the Yemeni capital, Sana'a. Now, viewers, as all of our guests spoke about this attack, this drone attack, that is, on this base, this Al-Anad base there in Aden, one of the largest in the country, is significant because it goes to show the military progress, if I may use that term, that the Houthis have made, the Ansarullah movement, but obviously also throws a wrench, as I said earlier in my introduction as well, vis-a-vis the peace process that many had thought begun in Stockholm and Sweden, but seemingly now has paused. We'll have to wait and see how all of this plays out in the middle. As I put the question to one of our guests, remain the impoverished Yemeni people who continue to suffer as these two sides continue to fight it out. We'll, of course, keep a very close eye on that situation in Yemen. Don't go anywhere, though. I'll be back after this short break with the next segment. Welcome back, viewers. In this segment, as promised, we're going to discuss the partial U.S. government shutdown, which will this weekend become the longest ever in history. Trump has held 25% of federal government employees hostage, insisting Democrats give in and agree to fund his U.S.-Mexico border wall. He's also threatened to enact a national emergency that would give him sweeping powers to spend, possibly as he so wishes. Now, to discuss all that a bit further, but before going to our guests, in fact, we're just going to show you a graph of what this would mean at this point in time. As I said there in my introduction, if this situation lasts till Saturday, i.e. tomorrow, this would then become the longest ever time that there has been this partial U.S. government shutdown. For this point in time, as of today, Friday, this is the second longest since 1995, I believe. So we'll have to wait and see how all of that plays out. Let me now introduce our guests who are joining us for this segment to discuss the situation further. We're joined by Mr. Michael Lane, who is a U.S. affairs expert and is also the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. He's joining us from Washington. And we're also joined by Onur Erim, who is a political advisor and author. He's also worked in the White House during the Clinton administration, and he's joining us from Istanbul. Onur and Michael, thank you both for joining us. Michael, I'd like to start with you because for those of us who are outside the United States, Michael, it sort of baffles the mind when we talk about a government shutdown, which doesn't happen many places around the world, I believe. Just put into context for us why this happens, in the United States, and what the situation means for the U.S.
Sure. Thank you very, very much for having me on this morning, or this evening, I guess, where you are. It's a pretty pathetic and embarrassing process that we go through, but it's not as significant as it sounds when you talk about a government shutdown. Essentially, it stems from the fact that the Congress fails to put on the president's desk for his signature legislation that will fund the government in whole or in part for the upcoming time frame that we're talking about. We have a constitutional process here in the United States for making appropriations but we haven't followed it to the letter in a long, long time. So we wind up with these situations where when we come to the deadline that money is only appropriated through X date, then the government shuts down. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that only non-essential aspects of the government shut down. So it's not really as big as it seems. Certainly, the military is still up and functioning. National defense is there. Senior citizens still get their Social Security checks, things like that. But other things that are deemed to be non-essential, such as national parks, that kind of stuff, wind up being shut while the Congress and the president are trying to work through their differences, or sometimes the House and the Senate are trying to work through their differences, and we wind up with non-essential areas of the government shut down. In this case, as you mentioned, it is about 25% of the federal government. There are only, I think, there are only about 7 agencies that are left unfunded at this point. Essential personnel within those unfunded agencies are still reporting to work and will get back pay, as are the ones who are not reporting to work because they're deemed not essential. They will still get back pay. So it's sort of a foolish and ugly and embarrassing exercise that we go through every once in a while. Both sides will play chicken.
All right, so Onur, I wanted to get your opinion on this because, as Michael there said, and as I said in my introduction, 25% of federal employees pretty much means 800,000 people, and specifically 350,000 of them are now furloughed, which is, just for our viewers' knowledge, a kind of temporary layoff. What do you make of that very real-world consequence of this political bickering that's happening?
It is certainly. It seems that since for the last 20, 30 years at least, it's a tool it's a much of a partisan tool that's being used by whomever is in power as opposed to the Congress. It's something that's not very, it feels very awkward to those that do not live in the United States or does not know about the system that well. But it's definitely one of those processes of the presidential system that the U.S. has been exercising for 200 years now, almost, well, more than 200 years. What is going on right now is, as we have seen in the past, since 1980, several times, as you mentioned, there seems to be a steep difference of opinion. Congress now has part of it has the power to Democrats is trying to push it up the hill for President Trump. The issue of the so-called wall to be erected between the U.S. and Mexico is splitting a lot of people. Now, what is kind of different in this case is that there may be as many supporters of being against the wall in the Republican Party as in the Democratic Party. Now, Trump knows this, obviously. He tries to see if there would be a ground where there's a common ground that they could pass this bill. It seemed that for a minute or two that there was going to be a resolution between them, or the other side pulled back. We don't know the exact the outcomes of that as of yet. But it seems that they're going to push it up the hill for a little bit further. Now, what is up ahead? Both sides have tools on their side. The Congress may indeed pass the bill the way they want it, bypassing the president, which doesn't seem that likely at this point. On the other side, Trump can actually erect this wall, although it would be painful under the military budget. But whatever both sides do, it will come at a cost, especially when there's now less than 2 years for the presidential campaign. It is a double-edged sword where it could benefit or be a big defeat for either side. So I'm sure in the coming within the next 10 to 15 days maximum, there will be a common ground where neither party will be satisfied fully, but they won't be dissatisfied fully either.
All right, so let me add another voice to this conversation. We're now joined by Mr. Ali Sarwar Naqvi, who is a former ambassador, in fact, to the United States, and he's joining us from Islamabad now on the line. Ambassador Naqvi, thanks for joining us here in the scope. Ambassador, this entire partial shutdown in the U.S. right now is because of this border wall which Trump wants to erect between the United States and Mexico. Do you think that is a good enough reason for this partial shutdown to occur? And what are your thoughts about that wall to begin with?
Well, it's a curious issue, crisis, because these kinds of crises haven't taken place recently in the history of most civilized nations, and the United States, of course, is the leader of most countries, being the biggest military power in the world. Now, there have been, walls and walls. There was the Great Wall of China, there was the Berlin Wall, and now Trump wants to give his name to a new wall between the United States and Mexico. So I think this is quite surreal that so much debate and argument and everything is going on in this proposal of his, because I don't think it merits such consideration. But the problem is that he is stalled the working of the entire U.S. government on petulantly sticking or adamantly sticking to his demand for more than $5 billion to set up the wall.
Yeah.
So it's a crisis, and the U.S. government is faced with a shutdown. In fact, if this prolongs, there is already 20 days of it that have passed. If it prolongs, even more departments might have to shut down, because except for essential services, the others may not get their funding in time to pay their salaries. So it's curious, I said, because the biggest government in the world in many ways, because the U.S. government is huge, is faced with a crisis of funding just because of an issue that does not merit much consideration.
Michael, I wonder what you make of that, because again, looking from the outside in, Michael, when we're talking about this border wall, which Trump, obviously promised during his presidential campaign, it confuses a lot of us. But then again, the U.S. president and his supporters would put forth the argument that, listen, we need the wall to keep out these illegal immigrants, as they say, the crime, as Trump would say, that's coming in over the border from Mexico. And then, he was standing in McAllen, Texas, and he said that he stood beside, all the things that Border Patrol, has caught from illegal immigrants, be they drugs or weapons. What are your thoughts on the need for this wall and whether that warrants this partial shutdown?
Well, it seems to me the wall should be evaluated in terms of how effective do you want our immigration control to be. Every layer of security that you add on top of existing layers of security, or everything that you enhance, improves the situation. So when President Trump looks at the wall from a policy security point, he knows that for the most part, by putting the wall in various places, it has been successful. We have a wall now in Yuma, Arizona. We have a wall in, I think, El Paso, Texas. We have a wall in California. Yeah. And these places have been very, very effective in channeling illegal immigrants into other areas where the Border Patrol has been more successful in finding them and detaining them. So from that point of view, from a policy point of view, it does seem to work. And the question becomes, is it worth the $5.7 billion that President Trump is asking for it? Or are there other ways that money can be spent, such as technology and enhancements of other things? The other side of the policy equation is the southern border really the problem that President Trump says it is, or are there other areas? Our biggest problem on immigration, everybody admits, is ports of entry, official ports of entry. But the southern border is still a very significant issue. Flip just for a second to the political side. As the ambassador mentioned, President Trump did have this as the signature issue of his campaign. We've already started the campaign for November of 2020, if you can believe it. There are already 3 or 4 Democrats that have announced, quote, exploratory committees, unquote, which means that they're already starting to raise money for 2020. There are as many as 32 Democrats who have made noises about jumping into it. So we're in full political campaign swing. The president has raised $100 million already for his own reelection. He's running advertisements on television from his reelection campaign that feature the border issue and things like that. The president feels that he cannot go to the voters in 2020 without having done everything possible to deliver on this promise. The Democrats know that, and they don't think they can go to the voters in 2020 without defeating the president on his signature issue. So the politics seems to have bubbled up and begun to overwhelm the policy issues on this particular thing. Okay, so then, Onur, the question then becomes, how far is President Trump willing to go to fulfill this campaign promise, do you think? There is talk now, Onur, of a national emergency being declared, something that Trump has now threatened a few times at the very least. At the latest, again, as I said, standing in McAllen in Texas. Do you think that he would enact a national emergency and send in the military to build this wall?
Well, as we all have been experiencing how Trump acts and how Trump executes in his power for the last 2 years, it is almost impossible to determine what Trump will do next and how far he will go. But the point is, I think, is as the previous 2 guests have mentioned, there's a couple of underlying issues here. Number one, Trump made this quote-unquote wall a big issue during his campaign. So he does not want to go into the his re-election campaign, which I agree has already started, without showing this as one of his victory flags. On the other side, I think the underlying issue may be that Democrats about a year ago, well, maybe more than Democrats, wanted to see the solution, saw the solution.
Let me go to Ambassador Naqvi. We seem to have just a few difficulties with Onur's connection there. Ambassador Naqvi, if I could bring you in and ask you, do you think, especially from the time that you spent in the United States, that this is a lot of politics more than actual concern about security? Is this more just partisan politics, do you think?
I can grant my other colleagues the argument that it is based on security concerns. But security concerns from poor immigrant Mexican workers and laborers is, I think, not a very justified concern. But if that be the case, then the approach should be more modern. I mean, walls were a thing of the past. Today we are in the technological age, and you can have shifting of people coming into your country. As it is, the U.S. has all kinds of very stringent entry laws. And they can further augment it. And as somebody just mentioned, I think that this money can be utilized for strengthening security. So that way, I mean, not $5 billion, but whatever may be required could be allocated for this purpose. So I think it's politics, but more than politics, it is just a kind of very simplistic, sticking or maintaining a position that Trump took in the election campaign. I mean, he has gone back on some of the things that he had promised, but that hasn't harmed him. His core constituency remains quite devoted to him. So I think a lot of politics is in it, but if he has to have it, then at what cost? Should it be at the cost of the economic stability of the United States, the governmental functioning of the United States, or should it be less than that? I think Trump should look for, as a statesman, as the President of the United States, he should look for a solution which is somewhat satisfactory to all, but does not push things to the brink.
Very well. Michael, I'll give you the final word. And I wanted to ask you, in fact, about the U.S. economy, because the Federal Reserve Chairman, as you can imagine, Michael, has said a longer shutdown would obviously affect the U.S. economy as well. How much of a concern do you think that will be on both sides of this argument?
The president's second signature issue is the economy. So I think if the economy starts to slow in growth or even stall, that in ways that are attributable to the shutdown, I think the pressure is more on President Trump as a result of that than it is in Congress, because the president is out there touting as part of the 2020 campaign that he has rebuilt and kickstarted the United States economy and things are fabulous. The Democrats, on the other hand, are talking about how the economy is not really that good, and if there becomes a slowdown and it confirms their political rhetoric, then they are politically in a better place than they would be if the economy continues. So I think an economic slowdown ultimately plays into the Democrats in Congress' hand. It depends really on how much that slowdown. Our economy is growing at over 3% a year. I believe the president will, for domestic political purposes, be able to tolerate a slowdown to somewhere in the high 2% a year. But if it goes much below that, then the pressure really gets on him to find a solution to that. But that's assuming that this is a long-term problem. We've had, everyone thinks this will be over by the end of January, one way or the other. We could be wrong.
Indeed. We'll keep a very close eye on that. But of course, we appreciate your insights and analysis as provided to us here in The Scope. That was Michael Lane, U.S. Affairs expert, founder of American Institute for Foreign Policy, speaking to us from Washington. It's very early in the morning there, so we appreciate, Michael, you getting up that early. Of course, we also had Ambassador Ali Sarwar Naqvi, former ambassador to the United States, speaking to us from the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. And we also had Onur Irim, who is a political advisor and author. He has worked with the White House during the Clinton administration as well, and he was speaking to us from Istanbul. Now, viewers, as all of our guests have spoken about, this sort of baffles the mind, this entire issue, when the rest of the world looks at the situation in the United States about how we can have such a partial shutdown take place because of political differences between two major parties. We'll, of course, have to wait and see how this affects not only just security issues or the border wall issue, but those furloughed employees, those federal government employees who are not currently being paid, who are having a hard time making ends meet now, even though they may very well get back pay whenever they're back at work. Again, like I said, we'll keep a close eye on this for here in The Scope, but that's all for this edition. I've been Waqar Rizvi.